Have you ever truly listened to silence? Not the quiet of an empty room, but the profound, weighted silence at the very heart of history. The scriptures tell us of a phenomenal child, born under a guiding star, a presence that made kings tremble and wise men kneel. We see him at 12 years old, seated among the learned masters in the temple, his words echoing not the naivety of youth, but the wisdom of eternity. And then, a void, a silence that stretches for 18 years. From the age of 12 to 30, the life of the most influential figure in history vanishes into an enigmatic shadow. The world has always asked, where did he go? A logical question, perhaps, but maybe not the right one. Perhaps the true question is not about a location, but about a purpose. Not where did he go, but what was he searching for? What could be so vital that it would draw the man who held the world's destiny into a quest lasting nearly 2 decades? What could forge a young carpenter from Nazareth into a revolutionary whose voice would shake an empire to its core? The answer is not found in burned scrolls or forgotten tales. It lies in a sound, a frequency, an echo more ancient than the mountains of Jerusalem. It was the call of the covenant. Forget the image of a gilded box of acacia wood. Imagine the Ark of the Covenant, not as a relic, but as a living source of energy, a convergence point between heaven and earth, where the presence of God was not a doctrine to be studied, but a reality to be felt. It was the heart of a primordial pact, a promise whispered at the dawn of creation. And for centuries, that heart was no longer beating in Jerusalem. It had been replaced by empty rituals, rigid laws, and priests who had forgotten how to listen. But the covenant never fell silent. It merely changed where it spoke from, and its call resounded far to the south, to a land unbound by the chains of Rome, a land of kings descended from Solomon, a land known as the rooftop of Africa, Ethiopia. The Holy Family's flight to Egypt, when Jesus was a child, was no mere escape from Herod's sword. It was a divine appointment. It was the first step on a preordained path, a pilgrimage leading deep into the African continent. Egypt was not the destination, it was the gateway. A gateway to a wisdom the Western world tried to forget. Because there, on the majestic highlands, guarded by mountains and an unshakable faith, the Ark of the Covenant waited. It did not wait to be found, but to be heard. The young Jesus was not searching for a physical treasure. He was following a spiritual frequency, a pull on his soul that only the pure in heart could hear. The 18 silent years were not a gap. They were a preparation, a time for his soul to attune itself to the oldest song of the universe, a time for him to learn not from the books of men, but from the very breath of God, preserved in the presence of the covenant. What he found in Ethiopia was not a new set of laws. He found the source of all law. He did not find a new religion. He found the heart of all true faith. And when he returned, he was more than a carpenter. He had become a living echo of the covenant itself. The silence in the Western Bible is not an omission, it is a veil drawn to hide a truth too dangerous, too radical, that the true authority of the Christ did not come from the temple in Jerusalem or the councils in Rome. It came from an African source, an unconquerable heritage. Today, we will pull back that veil. We are not going in search of lost years. We are going in search of their meaning, because in that silence, we will not find a void. We will find the key to understanding everything that came after. Prepare yourself, for this journey will change how you listen to history forever. The path began with sand and stars. As the Holy Family crossed into Egypt, they entered not just another country, but another world. Egypt was more than the land of pharaohs and pyramids. It was a living library of ancient wisdom, a crossroads for the spiritual currents of the known world. Along the Nile, a river that carried not just water, but stories, secrets, and prophecies, were hidden communities of truth seekers. The Essenes, Jewish mystics, who had renounced the corruption of the temple, the Gnostics, who believed in direct revelation, the sages who carried the legacy of Imhotep. They all existed here, in oases of knowledge, preserving fragments of a greater truth. The young Jesus, with his insatiable mind and awakened soul, did not pass through this land as a passive refugee. He was an active pilgrim. He listened, he learned, he questioned. He came to see that the Torah scrolls he knew were but one part of a much larger tapestry. But even in Egypt, he sensed this was only a stopover. The knowledge he gathered felt like tributary rivers, and he knew they must all flow from a single, greater source. In conversations with sages and hermits, one name was consistently spoken in hushed, reverent tones: Axum. And one symbol always accompanied it: the Ark of the Covenant. The road south was not an easy one. It stretched through the harsh deserts of Nubia, across the lands that would one day be Sudan, along an ancient trade route that carried not just gold and incense, but ideas. Every village, every tribe he encountered had their own stories of the Creator, their own rituals for connecting to the sacred. He did not see them as heathens. He saw different expressions of the same spiritual yearning. He learned the art of healing with herbs from wise women who lived in harmony with the earth. He learned of the stars not as inanimate fireballs, but as divine guides from astronomers whose eyes saw into both the past and the future. He learned that faith was not contained in stone buildings, but in the rhythm of community, in the sharing of a piece of bread, in the care for the vulnerable. This journey forged him. It stripped away any prejudice a young Jewish boy from Galilee might have held. He saw divinity in faces darker than his own, heard truth in languages he had never known. This was not a tour, this was a transformation. When he finally reached the highlands of Ethiopia, the very air was different. There was a stillness, a sanctity that permeated the landscape. The mountains themselves seemed to whisper ancient secrets. He did not arrive as a stranger, but as one returning home, though he had never been there before, because the frequency he had been following all this way was now powerful, clear, like the deep, resonant drumbeat of a great heart. He was met by priests of an ancient order, men whose lineage traced back to Zadok, the high priest of King Solomon. They were not surprised to see him. Their eyes held a look of recognition, as if they had been awaiting this arrival for generations. They did not ask him about law or prophecy. They looked into his soul and saw a readiness. They did not lead him to a treasure. They led him to a presence. The path to the source had ended, and the true encounter was about to begin. He had not just traveled a great distance geographically. He had traveled back in time, to the beginning, to the very point where the first covenant was made between God and humanity. He now stood at the threshold of revelation, prepared not just to learn about the covenant, but to become its living expression. They did not lead him into a gilded, ornate chamber. The resting place of the Ark of the Covenant was not a palace, but a sanctuary carved deep into the living rock of a mountain, a place of profound humility that nonetheless vibrated with an unmistakable power. There were no crowds, no ostentatious ceremonies, only silence, the soft glow of oil lamps, and a deep sense of awe that saturated the space. Jesus was not permitted to see the ark. No one was. To gaze upon it with physical eyes was not the point. The purpose was to feel its presence, to stand within its energetic field, and allow its wisdom to permeate every fiber of his being. The Ethiopian priests understood that the ark was not a container for stone tablets. It was a container for the very creative and ordering presence of God. It was a divine amplifier, a direct bridge between the seen and the unseen worlds. For days, perhaps even weeks, Jesus remained in that stillness. He fasted, he prayed, he meditated. He did not read texts or debate theology. He simply listened. He listened with his entire soul. And in that silence, the covenant spoke to him. It did not speak in words, but in instantaneous understanding. He understood that God's justice was not about punishment, but about the restoration of cosmic harmony. When a person acts unjustly, they are not breaking a rule. They are creating a dissonance in the symphony of creation, and justice is the act of retuning that note. He understood that mercy was not a reluctant pardon, but the recognition of the interconnectedness of all beings. To love your enemy was not a lofty moral command, it was a cosmic truth, because to harm another is ultimately to harm yourself within the shared web of existence. He grasped the concept of the kingdom of heaven. It was not a place in the clouds after death. It was a state of consciousness, a reality that could be experienced here and now, when an individual is in perfect alignment with the will of God, a will for harmony, love, and creation. The priests in Jerusalem spoke of obeying the law to enter the kingdom. The wisdom of the ark revealed that the law was created to help one realize the kingdom was already within them. This was the source of his authority. When he returned to Galilee and taught, he did not quote scholars or rabbis. He spoke as one who knew directly. When the scribes said, "It is written," they were speaking of a copy. When Jesus said, "Truly, I say to you," he was speaking from the original source. He hadn't just studied the map, he had visited the land. This encounter also reshaped his vision of the Messiah. The prophecies were not about a warrior king who would drive out the Romans with swords. The true Messiah was one who would bring about a revolution in human consciousness. He would be the one to break the internal chains, fear, greed, division that were more oppressive than any empire. His power would not be in an army, but in truth. His weapon would not be steel, but love. When his time in Axum came to an end, Jesus left not with a new set of knowledge, but as a new being. He was still the carpenter from Nazareth, but now his mind was a mirror, reflecting the wisdom of the cosmos. His soul was an echo of the immortal covenant. He was ready to begin his mission, not as a religious reformer, but as a world transformer, armed with a truth so ancient and powerful it could heal the sick, raise the dead, and ultimately challenge an empire. He had not found a golden box. He had found the sacred fire it was built to protect. When Jesus appeared at the banks of the Jordan River, where John the Baptist was preaching, he was not the boy who had disappeared 18 years prior. A profound change had occurred. It was not just in his eyes, which seemed to look past appearances and into the soul, but in his very presence a quiet, powerful stillness that commanded the attention of all around him. His baptism was not an act of repentance, but an act of declaration. It was the moment he stepped out of the shadows of preparation and into the light of his mission, and when he began to teach, those who listened knew immediately that this was something entirely new. Consider his teachings. The priests and Pharisees were obsessed with the minutiae of the law, how many times one must wash their hands, how many steps one could take on the Sabbath, how to tithe mint and dill. Their teaching was a labyrinth of rules, but Jesus did something different. He swept all that away and went straight to the heart of the matter. When he said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," he was not praising material poverty. He was echoing the wisdom of the ark. Only when you empty your ego of its wants and pride do you make room for the kingdom, the presence of God, to flood in. When he taught, "Love your enemies," it was not mere advice on kindness. It was the echo of the Axiomite understanding of interconnectedness. Hate binds both the hater and the hated, while love liberates them both. It was a spiritual law, as certain as gravity. His parables of the mustard seed, the sower, the prodigal son, were not simple moral stories. They were windows into how the universe actually works. The kingdom is like a mustard seed, small and seemingly insignificant, yet holding the potential of a great tree. God's mercy is limitless, like the love of the Father who waits for his lost son to return. These were not lessons he invented. They were truths he had observed from a higher perspective, a perspective he had accessed in Ethiopia. His authority baffled and enraged the religious leaders. "By what authority do you do these things?" they demanded. They wanted to know which school he had graduated from, which rabbi had certified him. They could not understand that his authority did not come from a human chain of command. It came from a direct connection. It was the difference between someone who has read a manual about the ocean and someone who has actually swum in it. Look at his healings. He did not perform complex rituals. He touched a person, spoke a word, and healing occurred, because he saw sickness not just as a physical ailment, but as a state of disharmony, a disconnection from the divine flow of life. His act of healing was the act of reconnecting that person to the source, of restoring the harmony that the wisdom of the covenant had taught him. Even his silence was powerful. When questioned by the chief priests, he would often remain silent, and his silence was more potent than any words. It was the silence of one who knows that truth does not need to defend itself. It's simply island. The people of Galilee felt this. They may not have understood the theology, but they felt the authenticity. "This man teaches as one who has authority," they said, "and not as their scribes." They were sensing, without knowing it, the echo of the Ark of the Covenant. They were hearing the wisdom of an ancient African pact, now being spoken by a carpenter with calloused hands and a soul that held the cosmos, on the dusty hills of their homeland. The mission had begun, and the world would never be the same. In the marble corridors of Rome, power had a distinct scent, the scent of iron, gold, and absolute control. The Roman Empire did not conquer the world with lofty ideas. It did it with disciplined legions, strategic roads, and a phenomenal ability to absorb or annihilate anything that threatened its order. By the 4th century, the empire was in crisis. Cracks were appearing in its foundations. The old gods of the Capitoline Hill were losing their power, and a new faith, one born in the dusty alleys of Judea, was spreading like an uncontainable fire. Christianity. At first, Rome tried to extinguish it with fire and sword. They threw its followers to the lions, crucified its leaders. But persecution only made the faith stronger. Emperor Constantine, more a master strategist than a devout believer, recognized a critical truth. If you can't beat it, co-opt it. He saw in Christianity a new kind of glue that could hold his fracturing empire together. One God, one emperor, one empire. It was a powerful formula. But there was a problem. The Christianity Constantine wanted to use was not a unified entity. It was a diverse, sometimes contradictory, collection of beliefs, texts, and communities. There were Gnostics, Arians, and countless other groups, each with their own version of Jesus. And there was one version, one deeper truth, that Rome feared above all others. It was not just the story of a black Messiah, it was the fear of a source of authority that lay beyond its control. Think about it. If the supreme spiritual authority of the Christ was derived from a pilgrimage to Ethiopia, if it was nourished by African wisdom and connected directly to a sacred relic, the Ark of the Covenant, that Rome did not possess and could not conquer, what did that mean? It meant that Rome could never be the true center of the faith. The Pope could never claim to be the sole successor. The empire could never fully control the narrative. The true authority would always lie elsewhere in a black land, an independent and ancient kingdom that their legions had never touched. This was the empire's core fear. A European, white-skinned Jesus could be shaped, packaged, and sold as a symbol of Roman power. But a Christ whose power was rooted in Africa could not. He would forever be an outsider, an untamable revolutionary force. He would be a constant reminder that there was a power higher than Rome. So, at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, Constantine's goal was not to find theological truth. It was to create uniformity. It was an imperial board meeting disguised as a religious conference. Bishops were summoned. Debates were orchestrated. and decisions were made based not on revelation, but on what was useful to the state. The story of Jesus' journey to Ethiopia, his connection to the Ark, the African wisdom that shaped his mission, all of it had to be erased. It was too dangerous. It undermined the very foundation of an empire-controlled Christianity. It had to be branded as heresy, as myth, as something not to be spoken of. The decision to whiten Jesus was not just an artistic choice. It was a calculated political act. By making him European, Rome co-opted him. They severed him from his revolutionary roots and turned him into an icon of the existing order. A black Messiah from Africa inspires liberation. A white, Roman-styled Christ demands obedience. The fear of the empire was not of a man, it was of an idea. The idea that divine freedom and spiritual authority could exist and thrive outside the walls of imperial power. And to extinguish that idea, they had to commit one of the most brutal acts of intellectual erasure in human history. Once the decision was made at Nicaea, the imperial machine went to work. The erasure was not accomplished with a single swift blow, but with 1,000 slow, methodical cuts over centuries, designed to bleed the life out of the original story until only a safe, hollow shell remained. The first step was to control the texts. An official canon of scripture was established. Books that were deemed compatible with imperial ideology, those that emphasized order, obedience, and church structure were included. Others, those that carried the fire of direct revelation, mystical cosmology, and prophecies that challenged worldly power, were cast out. The Book of Enoch, a text quoted in the New Testament and vital for understanding Jesus' worldview, was deemed apocryphal. Why? Because it spoke of fallen angels, celestial wars, and a divine Son of Man who existed before creation, concepts too wild, too uncontrollable for a simple state religion. The Book of Jubilees, which retells the Genesis story with details about angels and a cosmic calendar, was also sidelined. It presented a sacred timeline that was independent of the emperor's calendar. And other texts, like the Gospel of the Hebrews or the Gospel of Thomas, which focused on the inner, esoteric teachings of Jesus and individual enlightenment, were hunted down and destroyed. The empire did not want individuals who could find God on their own. It wanted a flock that needed shepherds appointed by Rome. The second step was to isolate and discredit the keepers of the truth. Ethiopia, with its ancient and unbowed church, became a particular target. They could not be conquered militarily, so they were attacked with propaganda. Roman and later European theologians painted the Ethiopian church as exotic, backward, even heretical. Their 81-book Bible was mocked as being adulterated. Their depiction of a black Messiah was dismissed as a local cultural interpretation, not a historical truth. In this way, Rome built an invisible wall around Ethiopia, preventing the rest of the Christian world from seeing a version of the faith untainted by empire. The third step was to change the image. Churches across the empire were adorned with new mosaics and paintings. Jesus slowly lost the Semitic features of a Middle Eastern Jew. His curly hair became straight and fair. His sun-darkened skin became pale. His fiery brown eyes were replaced with a placid blue. He was robed like a Roman philosopher or a Byzantine emperor. Every brushstroke was an act of erasure. Every marble statue was a lie carved into eternity. This erasure was terrifyingly effective. Within a few generations, the memory of an African-rooted Christ faded in the Western world. The story of his quest for the Ark became a forgotten legend. The 18 silent years were no longer seen as a purposeful pilgrimage. They were simply a blank space, a non-event. But truth has a strange quality. It can be buried, but it never truly dies. It survives in oral traditions passed from mother to daughter. It survives in manuscripts, quietly copied by monks in high mountain monasteries. It survives in the coded symbols of a people's art that never forgot. Rome thought it had won, It had created a god in its own image. It had cut the tree off from its roots, but it did not know that deep underground those roots were still alive, patiently waiting for the day when the dry ground of forgetting would crack, and the shoots of truth could rise to the light once more. The Great Erasure was a success, but it was not permanent. Centuries passed. The Roman Empire fell. European kingdoms rose and waned, but on the high plateau of Africa, a flame still burned. Ethiopia endured, an unconquered island of faith in a turbulent sea of history. They kept their 81-book Bible. They still venerated the Ark of the Covenant. And they held fast to the memory of a sacred royal lineage, a line said to descend from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba themselves. This lineage was more than a point of national pride. It was a theological statement. It said that the connection to the God of Israel did not just run through Jerusalem, but flowed powerfully through Africa. And prophecy foretold that one day a king from this line would arise, one who would bear the title Lion of the tribe of Judah, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Then, in 1930, the prophecy appeared to be fulfilled. A man named Rastafari Makonnen was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, taking the regnal name Haile Selassie I. His coronation was not just a political event, it was a cosmic one. For many, especially for the oppressed African diaspora in Jamaica, who would come to be known as Rastafari, this was the sign they had been waiting for. Haile Selassie was more than an emperor. He was the living embodiment of the immortal covenant. He was a symbol of black sovereignty, of black divinity, in a world that had tried to convince them they were inferior. He was the Lion of Judah, awakened, and roaring a challenge to the legacy of the Roman Empire. While European leaders saw him as an exotic figure from a faraway land, the Rastafari saw something else. They read their Bibles, the same Bible the empire had tried to control, and they saw him everywhere. In Psalm 68-31, "Princes shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God." In Revelation 5-5, "Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed." Haile Selassie became a lens through which the hidden history of the African Christ could be seen again. He never claimed to be the second coming of Jesus, but he never denied his sacred role and that of his nation. He defended the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. He preserved the ancient traditions. In his famous speech to the United Nations, he spoke a philosophy of racial equality and justice, words that sounded like a direct echo of the Sermon on the Mount. The rise of Haile Selassie was a shock to the system Rome had built. How could a black African king bear the titles of the Messiah? It broke the entire framework of a whitewashed Christianity. It posed an inescapable question. If the Lion of Judah was black, then what did the Lamb of God, who came from the same tribe, look like? Haile Selassie, by his very existence, opened a crack in the wall of the Great Erasure. Through that crack, the light of a long-buried truth began to shine. He did not need to preach a new gospel. His life was the sermon. He was a living reminder that the legacy of the Christ did not belong to Rome or Europe. It belonged to the world. And the heart of that legacy, its source of power, was still beating strong in Africa. The lion had awakened. And when a lion roars, the whole jungle listens. The world may not have been ready, but the roar had gone forth, and it would soon be amplified by a new kind of prophet, one who would carry the message from the mountains of Ethiopia to every corner of the planet. If Haile Selassie was the living symbol of the hidden truth, Bob Marley was the prophet who broadcast it to the world. He did not use theological treatises or ancient texts. His weapon was a 6-string guitar and a voice that could be as gentle as a lullaby and as powerful as thunder. Born into the poverty of Jamaica, an island still bearing the deep scars of slavery, Marley felt the emptiness of the Christianity the colonizers had brought. The white, blue-eyed Jesus preached in the churches, seemed to have no connection to the struggle and pain of his people. It was the God of the oppressor, not the savior of the oppressed. And then he heard of Rastafari, he heard of Haile Selassie, he heard of an Ethiopia that had never been conquered, and something ignited in his soul. It was not a new religion, it was a homecoming. It was the discovery of a spiritual heritage that had been stolen from his ancestors. Bob Marley's music became the vehicle for this revelation. He took the rhythm of reggae, the very heartbeat of the downtrodden, and made it a platform for preaching a decolonized gospel. Listen to his songs. They are not just songs, they are hymns, modern-day psalms. In Exodus, he sang of the movement of Jah people. He wasn't just talking about the Israelites leaving Egypt. He was talking about a spiritual exodus of all oppressed people out of Babylon, the imperial system that distorted truth and enslaved the human mind. In Redemption Song, one of his last and most profound works, he pleaded, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." This is a direct echo of the covenant's wisdom. True liberation comes not from without, but from realizing the kingdom within. And perhaps most powerfully, in war, with lyrics taken almost verbatim from Haile Selassie's UN speech, he sang, "Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war." Marley understood that the fight against racial injustice was not merely political, it was a holy war, because the idea of racial inferiority is rooted in the theological lie that God created some in his image and not others. By singing these words, Marley exposed that lie and proclaimed the divinity of all people. Marley did what no trained theologian could. He took the story of the African Christ out of the high mountain monasteries and ancient texts and put it into stadiums, onto radio waves, and into living rooms around the world. He made millions of people who would never read the Book of Enoch ponder the deepest themes of faith, justice, and liberation. His guitar became a mobile ark of the covenant, emitting a frequency of truth that the Babylonian system could not jam. His voice was the roar of the Lion of Judah, translated into a language every heart could understand. He was not just singing about a king in a faraway land, he was singing about the king within every listener. He was inviting everyone to join the exodus out of the empire's lies and return to the truth of their own divine origin. Bob Marley was not a pop star. He was a keeper of the echo, a dreadlocked prophet who used music to awaken a sleeping world to an ancient and liberating truth. Bob Marley's song planted seeds, and they took root in the most unexpected soil. The fire of awakening was not confined to the Rastafari movement. It merged with other fires of the black liberation struggle around the world, creating a conflagration of theological rediscovery. At the heart of that fire, in the United States, was a voice of razor-sharp, uncompromising clarity. Malcolm X, raised in a society poisoned by racism, Malcolm saw the core hypocrisy of a Christianity that preached love but practiced oppression. For him, the image of a white Jesus was the most potent tool of spiritual domination. The white man has brainwashed us black people to fasten our gaze upon a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, he once stated forcefully, and we're supposed to worship this. But no, when you open the Bible, when you go into history, you realize that Jesus wasn't white. He wasn't a European. He was one of us. Malcolm's words were not just about skin color, they were about reclaiming power. He understood that the image you worship shapes your identity. If you worship a God who looks like your oppressor, you will forever see yourself through the oppressor's eyes. But if you realize that the Savior looks like you, walked a path like you, and suffered like you, everything changes. Shame is replaced by divinity. Mental slavery is replaced by freedom. Malcolm X, though a Muslim, articulated a truth that many black Christians felt in their hearts but did not dare to speak. He tore down the statue of the imperial god and challenged people to search for a deeper, more authentic truth. And they did. Black liberation theologians like James Cone began to build an entire theological framework around the idea of the Black Christ. Cone argued that in a racist society, Jesus must be identified as black because he is always on the side of the oppressed. If Jesus were alive in 20th century America, he would not be in the comfortable suburban churches. He would be in the ghettos, marching for civil rights, and would likely be killed by the system all over again. This fire spread. Artists began painting Jesus with African features. Poets wrote of a Messiah with skin of bronze and hair like wool. Preachers began to proclaim from the pulpit a God who was not a white stranger, but a black brother. This was not an attempt at reverse racism or a whimsical rewriting of history. It was an act of restoration. It was the recovery of what had been stolen by Rome's great erasure. It was reconnecting with the evidence in the Bible itself, the description of Jesus in the book of Revelation, with hair white like wool and feet like fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, images that had been ignored for centuries. They were discovering that the story of Ethiopia was not an isolated tale. It was the missing piece, the key that unlocked everything. It provided the historical and theological foundation for what their hearts already knew to be true, that their faith was not a European import. It was an African heritage, reclaimed. This unquenchable fire continues to burn today. It burns in faith-inspired movements for social justice. It burns in online discussions where a new generation is asking the questions their parents were afraid to ask. They are digging into the banned texts, exploring the history of Ethiopia, and refusing to accept a version of faith that has been filtered through the lens of imperial power. From Haile Selassie, the symbolic lion, to Bob Marley, the musical prophet, to Malcolm X, the uncompromising voice of truth, the flame was passed from one to another. It is the fire of a truth that cannot be extinguished, a reminder that even after centuries of being buried under the ashes of empire, the truth will always find a way to rise. We began this journey in a silence in history. We followed the call of an ancient covenant across deserts to the heart of Ethiopia. We witnessed the wisdom of the Ark forge a revolutionary. We heard the echo of that wisdom on the hills of Galilee, and we exposed the fear of an empire, a fear that led to a brutal erasure, designed to hide a truth it could not control. We have seen how that truth was kept alive by a people who never bowed, and then reawakened by an emperor, sung by a prophet, and proclaimed by freedom fighters. And now we stand here, at the end of this journey, and the final question is no longer about history. The question is about you. What does this story mean for you, right now, in the 21st century? Perhaps the deepest lesson is not that the Ark of the Covenant is a physical box hidden in Ethiopia. Perhaps that is merely the outer symbol for a greater truth. Perhaps the real Ark of the Covenant is a potential that exists within every human being. It is the capacity for a direct connection to the divine, unmediated by priests, institutions, or empires. It is the kingdom of heaven within you, as Jesus himself taught. His journey to Ethiopia was not to find something he lacked. It was to awaken and affirm something that was already there. Rome's great erasure was not just about hiding a historical fact. It was about making you forget that you, too, have this capacity for direct connection. By placing all power in the hands of the Church, in rituals, in approved doctrines, they tried to convince you that you needed them to get to God. They tried to make you forget the covenant written on your own heart. But Ethiopia did not forget. Haile Selassie did not forget. Bob Marley did not forget. And now you are being invited to remember that you are made in the image of a Creator who is not confined by race or geography, to remember that true spiritual authority comes not from following external rules, but from listening to the still, small voice within. To remember that mercy and justice are not abstract concepts, but cosmic laws you can live by every day. The journey to rediscover the African Christ is not just a historical exercise, it is an invitation to begin your own pilgrimage, not to Ethiopia, but deep into the landscape of your own being. It is a journey to strip away the layers of lies that empire, whether the ancient Roman one or the modern systems of oppression, has placed upon you. It is a journey to find the unquenchable fire of truth that burns in your soul. Do not just accept this story, question it, research it, but more importantly, feel it. Listen for its echoes in your own life, because the covenant is not a relic of the past. It is a living promise for the future. It is the promise that no matter who you are, what you look like, where you come from, you carry within you a divine spark. They tried to bury the truth, but they could not, because the truth is not in scrolls that can be burned or statues that can be smashed. The truth is in you. The covenant is immortal, and it is calling your name. Are you listening?